To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, visit gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. In 1957, a group of Black high school students from Arkansas were about to walk into the history books. The Supreme Court ruled that all public schools had to be desegregated 3 years earlier. But the Supreme Court saying something and it actually happening are two very different things. It would take national attention, an intervention by President Eisenhower, and an escort from federal troops for the Little Rock Nine to be allowed into the all-white Central High. But they faced continued harassment from classmates, and the governor ended up closing all high schools in Little Rock, rather than allowing desegregation to happen. The civil rights movement, with its demonstrations, protests, and sit-ins, was needed because the end of slavery didn't grant everyone equal treatment under the law. In fact, the late 19th and early 20th centuries have been described as the low point of race relations in the US. History has shown that expanding civil rights only happens when everyday people challenge those in power using the most effective tactics available to them. So, the first way civil rights activists confronted discrimination was through the courts and later, Congress. Hi, I'm Carmela Boykin, and this is Study Hall, Power and Politics in US Government. We can't talk about the civil rights movement without revisiting the Reconstruction era of the 1860s and 70s. After the Civil War, the US government grappled with how to integrate 4 million formerly enslaved people into the social, economic, and political systems of the country. Some major progress was made at the federal level through Reconstruction amendments, like by at least theoretically giving Black men the right to vote. But around that same time, state governments enacted a series of discriminatory laws called Black Codes to limit the political power and freedom of Black people. Black Codes evolved into Jim Crow laws, which were most widespread and oppressive in the South. Even though the first usage of the term was in northern states like New York and Massachusetts before the Civil War. Jim Crow laws affected every aspect of daily life, prohibiting Black people from living in white neighborhoods and forcing them to use separate public pools, buses, trains, cemeteries, phone booths, and more. Jim Crow laws disenfranchised Black people, depriving them of meaningful political and civic participation. But dismantling this widespread discrimination called for new tactics, and the state legislatures couldn't be trusted. After all, they passed the Jim Crow laws in the first place. So in the early 1900s, activists started using the courts to push back against de jure segregation, or segregation based on or mandated by laws. A lot of that started when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, was founded in 1909. They used the judicial system to challenge discriminatory laws around the country, making huge strides for civil rights, particularly with voting and education. In 1915, the NAACP helped get grandfather clauses declared unconstitutional, which excluded people from literacy requirements if their grandfather had been able to vote, disenfranchising Black voters. And in 1954, the NAACP's hand in Brown versus Board of Education is what allowed Arkansas's Little Rock Nine to enroll at Central High School. The decision by the NAACP and other civil rights leaders to target the courts for action rather than heading straight for Congress is an example of venue shopping, or making strategic decisions about how to advocate and where. Because trying to influence laws and policies at the federal level takes a lot of resources that advocacy groups don't always have. And at first, targeting the court system had two big advantages for civil rights advocates. First, federal judges are appointed for life, so they can make decisions the general public might not like at the time. Whereas in Congress, elected officials have to rely on voters to keep them in office, meaning they often go with what the majority of constituents want. That made the federal courts a good place to challenge public discrimination, which happens in places open to the general public. The second reason civil rights activists targeted the court system was the makeup of the Supreme Court itself. Ideally, the Supreme Court has 9 totally impartial justices, but they're also people with different backgrounds and different ways of interpreting the law. And side note, the way we talk about each Supreme Court era is by using the name of whoever was Chief Justice at the time. Between 1953 and 1969 was the Warren Court, and it was probably the most liberal Supreme Court in US history. The Warren Court saw the Constitution as a living document that was meant to evolve as the country evolved, and that the point of the judiciary was justice. Their decisions greatly expanded civil rights, like by desegregating schools and protecting interracial marriage. But because the federal court system is limited in the kinds of cases they hear, whether laws are constitutional or not, it sometimes can't tackle the private discrimination that happens when private businesses treat people differently based on prejudice. On top of that, finding justice in the court system can be very slow because the Supreme Court doesn't have the ability to enforce its decisions. Like with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, it didn't include a timeline for desegregation and just said integration would happen with, quote, all deliberate speed. So by the 1950s and 60s, even with some important wins in the courts, activists started an unprecedented, unified effort to fight inequality across the country, outside the court system. The most important avenue where activists took action was through grassroots organizations. The focus shifted to using nonviolent direct action campaigns like marches and demonstrations alongside litigation. Groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee led forms of passive resistance or civil disobedience. They encouraged people to refuse to follow discriminatory laws as a form of peaceful protest. One pivotal example was the Greensboro sit-in. On February 1st, 1960, after months of preparation, a group of first-year college students started a sit-in at the Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworths. It was a discount department store that had a whites-only lunch counter. Their plan was to sit down, order food, and get denied service, and refuse to leave as a form of civil disobedience. They'd bought toothpaste and notebooks from other counters before sitting down. So when the waitress said she couldn't serve them, they replied that they had already been served, just in a different part of the store. And they had the receipts to prove it. So after that, the Greensboro Four came back day after day, but with more protesters each time until Woolworths was so full of people they were spilling out onto the sidewalk outside. And when photos of their sit-in hit the newspapers nationwide, people were inspired to stage similar protests at segregated lunch counters across the country. As more people joined in, business was disrupted and sales dropped by as much as a third. So after 6 months of protests, the Woolworths in Greensboro integrated, and the young men, known as the Greensboro Four, came back and ate at the same lunch counter where everything started. While the Greensboro Four ushered in a new wave of nonviolent protests in the US, activists were often met with violent resistance from members of the white majority. Counter-protesters spit at them, threw eggs at them, and harassed them with abusive language and physical violence. But this came as no surprise to activists, since nonviolent civil disobedience was expected to be met with violence and intimidation. And as the protests gained national attention, they helped to sway public opinion and pave the way for changes in legislation. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy proposed what would become the Civil Rights Act. Although public support for sweeping civil rights legislation had grown, polls from that time said 78% of white people would move if their neighborhood became too integrated. So getting a civil rights bill passed was going to take time and political effort. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed for the passage of the Civil Rights Act in Congress. And despite a months-long filibuster, it was passed in 1964. It was a landmark piece of legislation that prohibited discrimination against certain groups in things like employment and public places. It also banned unequal voter registration requirements. That same year, the 24th Amendment was ratified and abolished poll taxes, which had made people pay fees to vote. But neither stopped efforts to maintain the white-dominated political structure, particularly in the South, as Southern officials continued to resist black voter registration. So, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. planned to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, to bring national attention to the need for national voting rights. On March 7, 1965, protesters began their march only to be immediately confronted, tear-gassed, and beaten by Alabama state troopers and white vigilante groups. Since it was televised, the march brought swift national attention. Protests broke out in over 80 U.S. cities in the following days. And a week later, President Johnson introduced what would become the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that removed most barriers to voter registration other than citizenship. That led to an immediate increase in black voter registration, showing how much public opinion can shape legislation. But voter discrimination isn't just a thing of the past. In the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder case, the Supreme Court invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act. The act had required places with a history of discrimination to have federal oversight when they changed their voting procedures. Once that was gone, it led to some things like some states limiting early voting and making ballot drop-offs more difficult. As of 2019, 13 states closed over 1,600 polling places, and across 49 states, 440 bills restricting voting access in some capacity were introduced in 2021 alone. But in 2023, the Supreme Court decided that Alabama would have to redraw some of its congressional district maps because they likely violated the Voting Rights Act. More than 1 out of every 4th person in Alabama is black, but only 1 out of 7 districts is majority black. So this ruling should create new majority black districts in Alabama, as well as other states. All of this back and forth should remind us that the civil rights movement wasn't really that long ago. The Reverend Jesse Jackson participated in the Selma marches, and in 2021, at age 79, he was arrested while protesting for voting rights. And Jim Crow laws didn't just target black people. All people of color were subject to segregation. For example, in 1927, the Supreme Court held that a US-born child of Chinese descent was barred from attending a white high school in Mississippi. Arizona had extreme restrictions on who could marry whom. And in 1947, some California schools were ordered to integrate Mexican-American children into their classrooms. To this day, people of color, and especially black people, face discriminatory housing policies that isolate them into areas with lower investment. That means fewer housing upgrades and amenities like grocery stores, on top of having more noise, water, and air pollution from highways and factories. All this, plus the movement of white people from cities to suburbs, or white flight, has created de facto segregation, the effect of segregation that occurs because of the choices individuals make, not because of laws or rules. These big societal issues will continue to be shaped by Congress and Supreme Court decisions. But those institutions are very different now compared to the 50s and 60s. The current Roberts Court is, by some estimates, the most conservative in decades. In fact, as of 2022, the Supreme Court is more conservative than 75% of people in the US, which means that the vast majority of people may not agree with any decisions they make. Congress is increasingly divided and unable to pass significant legislation, making it tough to combat discriminatory policies. And that leaves a lot of questions when deciding how to advocate for civil rights today. But we can't forget that the strategies used during the civil rights movement are alive and well, like how the Women's March in 2017 was the largest single-day protest in US history. So, in order to hold our leaders accountable and make sure that policies reflect what the people want, it's clearly important to vote. But we shouldn't count out collective action, because looking back at the efforts of the brave students like the Little Rock Nine and the Greensboro Four, we can see the power that everyday people have to sway public opinion and policy. If you're enjoying Study Hall Power in Politics and US Government and are interested in taking an online course and earning college credit, go to gostudyhall.com or click on the button to learn more. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.